Welcome, everyone, to The Interview, one of our podcasts here at the American Mind. I am your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. Today, I talk with Scott Yenor, old friend of Claremont, professor of political science at Boise State University. Scott has a new book out, The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. We had Scott on as a guest to the Roundtable podcast. He was giving us an update on his other work, which is helping state legislators think through the course offerings in various critical race theory stuff. It was in Idaho. They've made some good progress there, including the state legislature docking some funding from their state universities for indoctrinating their students. Scott is also a Washington Fellow at the Center for the American Way of Life, the Claremont Institute's new-ish center in Washington, D.C. Scott's writing is on feminism, identity politics, and all the rest. This book, as you may have gathered from the title, is about feminism and its effects on the family. It's a serious book. It dives deeply into the intellectual history of feminism, its political effect in America, and then what we ought to do about it, both in terms of policy and in terms of rhetoric and in terms of understanding and intellectual work. So this was a great conversation with Scott, and I hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome, Scott Yenor. Very good to have you. We're here to talk about your, well, it's now not, smashingly new, but still quite new book, The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. Fans of the American Mind Roundtable have heard me reference this book, and we even had you on to give a report about a somewhat related topic, your efforts against critical race theory and identity politics education in Idaho. But today we want to talk about the book. Why? Well, let's just start with a general, just for folks who aren't familiar with the book and we want to intrigue and encourage to go buy it. Why was this book needed, or what was the inspiration for it?
Well, I wrote a book on the family in 2011 for Baylor called Family Politics, which was a history of marriage and modern political thought.
Right.
It went from Locke to John Paul II. And it just talked about how two ideas had kind of conquered marriage or shaped our idea of it, the idea of contract and the idea that the job of modern societies is to conquer nature. And that left us to a point where it's really difficult to defend the family in any way. And then this book is kind of a sequel to that book. It tries to give an account of what the particular ideologies of the last 50 years that have been attacking, undermining the culture of that's protective of family life, and to show what their aspirations are, and to show why they're incomplete, and then to give a kind of roadmap to how to begin to fight them in the public square and in the culture generally. Those three ideologies are feminism, contemporary liberalism, and sexual liberation theory. And all of them are, in line with those modern aspirations that I talked about in my first book, the idea that we're conquering nature and that only relationships based on consent are legitimate. And so I thought it was necessary to really complete the analysis, because the first book looks kind of abstract from the perspective of trying to understand today's situation. The second book is an attempt to really try to lay bare what today's situation is when it comes to the family, to show why those ideologies are powerful and why they're incomplete or wrong-headed as they try to understand life.
Right. You and I were chatting before about what aspect of the book to draw out, given the fact that you've done some media elsewhere for this, so we want to stay fresh and interesting. But before we do that, I did want to just get to the root, the ideological root or intellectual root of feminism as you understand it. I think a general public sometimes finds, these deep dive type of works, or at least a portion of yours is very practical at points and talks about policy, but people, they're just sort of skeptical that somehow we're ruled by ideas scribbled down, a century or two ago, let alone longer. But is there really one major source of this way of thinking about family and women that you could point to, or maybe if there's more than one, a few?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that modern feminism is called second wave feminism, and its root is in the great French thinker Simone de Beauvoir. I don't think much happens in the feminist orbit that doesn't trace directly to her.
Mm-hmm.
Her book, The Second Sex, was written in France in 49 and published here in 1954 in translation. And, she just, everything that all subsequent feminists think is found in that book. The idea that the goal of life is for women to be independent emotionally and economically of the family. The idea that differences between men and women are traceable to what she and her followers call patriarchal socialization. The idea that in order for women to be genuinely free, they have to be liberated from traditional sexual morality as it points to monogamous marriage. Those things are all in her book. And subsequent feminists pick up on one element or another of those. They hedge here and there, given the demands of the time. But we're really operating within the playbook that Beauvoir put forward in 54. Betty Friedan wrote later on, after she wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, that she was just a simple country boy when she read Simone de Beauvoir's book. And then she suddenly woke up and said, wow, I'm more than just a housewife. and she traces her own intellectual genesis to Beauvoir. And many of the other really important second wave feminists do the same. Very few of them in the last 30 years really cite or talk about Beauvoir, but they're always operating within her ideas or her general playbook. And so I call those people who are operating within her playbook under laborers who are kind of completing her project. And so, Beauvoir is the one I would trace it to.
Yeah. Friedan was being disingenuous, of course, wasn't she?
Yes, she was a communist operator before she read Beauvoir. But, it's a good story. I think there's a lot of myth making in many of these feminist works that they try to make themselves into the hero that modern women are supposed to aspire to be.
Right.
And Friedan did that in spades, both in Feminine Mystique and in her memoirs.
Yeah. Interesting. That brings another thing to mind, which maybe you could help us understand. So a lot of us have gone to school of late on we may have been acquainted with some of the roots of it, but with sort of critical race theory and its intellectual antecedents. So it's, there's the postmodernism of pretty soon after de Beauvoir's book comes to the United States, we get postmodernism out of the French Academy, 1960s, 1970s, and you get all these, this whole constellation of academic disciplines, not all at the same time, but broadly speaking, they're now, gender and women's studies, which seems to be the most relevant to this topic of your book. There's, critical race theory. There's queer studies. There are all this post-colonial studies, post-colonialism itself. Then now even, the latest entrants are the ridiculous. I encourage people just to do quick Google to figure out how ridiculous, but fat studies and disability studies. Where does feminism fit in all this? How is it taught on campus? The college campus and all of its woke monstrosity pretty well. How does this feminism taught these days or disseminated to college age kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I look at feminism as critical. By critical, I mean, it's unmasking. The things that look to be true on the surface are really not the reality. There's something underneath it that's the reality. So feminism has always looked at the differences between men and women as being purely the product of society. And then they use their critical lens to try to show that that's not the truth. And that underneath, we're not men and women, but individuals, each with the same aspirations, each with the same psychology. So the approach that all these critical studies take is that society has caused these inequalities or differences. And if we could rejigger the institutions, we could eliminate those differences and the disparities between the groups, and come to treat everyone as an individual, and everyone be liberated from the roles that they've been told that they are supposed to play. So I think of feminism as the first critical theory. And many later feminists really picked this up. The most famous is, I think, in your neck of the woods, Judith Butler. Mm-hmm. She's up in Berkeley, and she's she's explicitly a critical theorist of gender, who tries to show that every characteristic that women have taken on has been the result of patriarchal socialization. And it can be different if we would just undo gender and kind of promote more confusion about men and what men and women are. We could get people to escape the gender roles that they've taken on. So yeah, feminism is a big time critical theory.
Right.
Shares all of the attributes of the critical race theorists and fat studies and all the others.
Right. Yeah. Just to give people a flavor of the kind of postmodern madness that this has descended to, in disability studies, there's a movement. Disability is said to be a social construct, as that term has come to be known in all of these studies. That is, nobody is really truly disabled or any less able than anyone else. It's just the way that we've placed them in that disadvantageous position, while at the same time, of course, their disability or whatever they have that shouldn't be called a disability as they think of it, is a core part of their identity. So you have folks even calling for, for example, a deaf person who might have some surgery or a cochlear implant or something to help them hear more, as being discouraged from doing that thing because that would somehow do harm to their identity. It's really madness.
Yeah, if society just wouldn't make hearing so important,
right,
being deaf wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. And
so it's really society's way of organizing itself that's brought about this so-called disability of being deaf.
I must thank you.
The worldview.
Yeah, and I must thank you, Scott, for reading Judith Butler, so none of us have to. I mean, she's one of the more abstruse and incomprehensible.
She's a two-time winner of the worst academic writer, the only two-time winner. Yeah, those were tough days.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Good. Well,
I have a syllogism in the book about Judith Butler that goes something like, no good writer would use the word anonormativity. Judith Butler uses the word anonormativity. Therefore, she's not a good writer.
Irrefutable in my book. Well, let's talk a little bit about sexual liberation. And I wanted maybe to frame it this way. You may have some folks nodding along, as has been my experience at least, with critiquing the more radical aspects of feminism, the ultimate goal of destroying the family, of claiming that men and women are no different. But you get into sort of practical aspects of it, and it becomes clear that we've been so liberalized in the more modern sense of that term, or the sense of that term in the last 50 years or so, that people just can't even imagine going back to a pre-sexual liberation mindset. The notion, people think it's insane that anyone would suggest or even hint at, banning, for example, birth control, let alone, of course, abortion. So what is it? I mean, what is it about the sexual liberation, or what link does the sexual liberation have to feminism? Is feminism its real root? Is it something else? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sexual liberation is different analytically from feminism. The goal that sexual liberation theorists and practitioners put for themselves is to get human beings beyond repression. And they aren't, they trace their lineage back to Sigmund Freud, but Freud actually thought repression was okay. It helped to build civilization up. It channeled man's sexual energy in different directions so that they may have been kind of sexually desirous, but instead of having sex, they built trains or blew up mountains or joined the army or became statesmen. Their sexual energy was channeled in positive directions to build civilization up. And that led to the equation of civilization and sexual repression. And what the real sexual liberation theorists, and here we're talking Herbert Marcuse, men in the 50s, Wilhelm Reich is the most famous of them from the 50s. They equated repression with civilization too, but they thought it was necessary to destroy both. And in fact, destroy modern civilization in order so people could express themselves sexually in whatever way they wanted. The way I put that in the book is a little couplet called, which I use, all orgasms are created equal, is one of the principles of sexual liberation theory. And that's just a way of saying, look, no matter what way you achieve sexual satisfaction, it's good. Society should be neutral when it comes to what ways. And in fact, it needs to be more than neutral, because we've for so long favored monogamous expressions of sexuality that it's necessary really to favor the polymorphous perversity. Once again, another word from Marcuse that I think he takes from Freud. It's necessary to promote these alternative ways of sexually expressing yourself in order to kind of balance up the historical record on these things. So the feminists glommed onto the important part of sexual liberation theory was that it was important to detach sex from monogamous marriage and procreation. Mm-hmm. In order for sex to be free from any duty or obligation, you needed to divorce it from those normal expressions of duty and obligation. So feminists really embrace sexual liberation as necessary to liberate women from marriage. And the tools came about at the same time, which you mentioned, contraception and abortion, which help to achieve those things. But there's other things that helps divorce these things. We need to embrace cohabitation as equal to marriage in our laws. We need to embrace divorce culture that detaches sex from an enduring marriage. And so they really complement one another, but sexual liberation theory goes beyond feminism in embracing all ways of sexual expression.
Yeah. How does gay marriage fit into all this? Because it's at one time it's the desire to not limit, I guess, if we were being charitable, the blessings of marriage, or a couple of them at least, some of them not being possible with gay marriages, and not limit those just to a man and wife. But, from what we've understood from your book and just in the, 20 or so minutes we've been talking so far, feminism, sexual liberation, I mean, the goal, marriage is kind of repressive in a way. Does that calculus change at all with the onset and, wide legality? I put those in the positivistic sense, at least, of gay marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I think of gay marriage as one of the culminations of both feminism and sexual liberation theory. Feminism had long thought that marriage needed to be separated from gender roles or sex roles, and many feminists really embraced same-sex marriage as a way of kind of giving the death knell to the idea that there were sex roles within marriage. So they thought it would be a very disruptive practice when it came to sex roles. And of course, the sexual liberation theorists liked gay marriage as a movement beyond marriage. That is, they thought of gay marriage as so disruptive that it would take the idea of marriage down further in public honor and esteem, and there would be fewer children born, less reason for marriage, and therefore would help deinstitutionalize marriage over the course of time. And I think there's just another factor in that is that same-sex marriage, I think, really was the trigger for not only woke capitalism, but the radicalism of today's left. It was the success that they had in achieving gay marriage that gave them momentum, made them think that nothing would ever arise within American society to stop them, and has led to a kind of acceleration of all of these cultural issues. It wasn't a week after Obergefell was decided, that the cake baking happened.
Mm-hmm.
And episodes happened, and then transgenderism became an issue where all these same groups began accelerating their attacks on the traditional ideas that there are men and women. So I think same-sex marriage was a real accelerant in the decline of marriage from all of the perspectives, but also an accelerant in the collapse of America's regime. And I do think that if you transported one of us back to 100 years ago, and it's 1920, the biggest difference we would notice in the world, aside probably from the phones, is just how men and women act toward one another, mm-hmm. and how our media presents what a respectable man and what a respectable woman is. And those changes really have been stirred by the sexual liberation, the way women dress, the way they present themselves, and the same thing with men, I think, in public is much less formal. There's a lot more skin shown, especially now during summer. Even here in Idaho in summer, there's a lot of skin shown. And so I think the sexual liberation is one of these things that is almost an incalculable effect on our lives.
Yeah, I think that's true. You describe the way feminism has sort of plowed across the West as a rolling revolution. In this question of marriage, what's the next turn in the roll past gay marriage?
Well, the intellectuals began almost immediately writing books in defense of plural marriage. Mm-hmm. 3 books came out either during the Obergefell argument, between Obergefell arguments and the decision, or immediately after, seeking to make plural marriage the next role in it. And I think that probably makes sense as the next role. It further deinstitutionalizes it by taking it beyond man and woman, and now beyond one or two, mm-hmm. to multiple. And as you take away the characteristics of marriage, it becomes more and more difficult to have any public recognition of it or public support for it. So it seemed like plural marriage would be the next step toward the deinstitutionalizing of marriage. But I think the transgender movement has added a different flavor to that. Because if you can't even, bless the idea that there are men and women, then the purpose of marriage and the other elements that bring people together is much more difficult to defend in public. So that was an interesting turn. When I was writing the book, I really did think it was going to be plural marriage, and there have been court cases on these matters, mm-hmm. but that hasn't turned out to be exactly the case.
Right. Yeah, our friend of Claremont, frequent CRB contributor, I don't know if you know him, but Richard Samuelson used to joke about gay marriage that, you'll have two Italian guys in the mob marrying, so they don't have to testify against each other. But a plural marriage would be even better. Everyone in the family could just marry each other, the crime family, and then none of them would have to testify against the other. Well,
it's a great strategy.
Yeah, I know,
we don't weigh the benefits of this as much as we need to, I guess.
Yeah, the whole think tank, we could all marry each other, so they can't put us in the gulag down the road. Let's talk a little bit about, I wanted to get back to this popular objection amongst, I think, fence sitters or independents on this issue. Just, they're not quite sure what to think about it. They're maybe not that political. They don't wade into this kind of stuff, but it's worth just sort of laying out de Beauvoir's case and then her successors. But, the abolition of the family, it's maybe less true lately because of, as you've said, the kind of radical turn of the left and the trans stuff and everything else. But, maybe as little as 5 years ago, someone would retort, I mean, come on, really, feminism, it was about voting. Now it's about being able to work, not being enslaved to the kitchen. It's about equal rights and equal pay. But surely you can't be serious that feminism ultimately wants to abolish the family.
Well, they do, and that's my short answer. Right. But so I think all of these contemporary issues need to be seen just in a big context. Why do they want equal pay for equal work? Well, the hope is that you can achieve a kind of independence, emotional and economic, from the family so that you can leave whenever you want. Well, when you cultivate the idea that you're going to be able to leave whenever you want and that you want to be independent, well, you've actually created an ethic that is hostile to marriage, because marriage implies a kind of dependence of man on woman and woman on man. So, underneath these slogans is a view that that discourages dependence of one person on another, that lies at the heart of marriage. I mean, another very common objection, Ryan, I think, is that feminism is just about choice.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to give women more choices than they had, and I'm not necessarily opposed to giving anyone more choices or opportunities than they used to have. But is it going to be okay if more women become nuns? Is it going to be okay if more women have 8, 10, 12 children? Are feminists going to celebrate those particular kinds of choices? The answer is no. They don't want particular kinds of choices to be made. They defend choice so as to destroy what used to be. And after they've destroyed it, choices now can be limited, or different kinds of choices will be more honored than what used to be honored. So I think many of these liberal ideas, like equal pay or choice, are just wedges to get rid of what used to be. And so we can create a new notion of honor and then limit choice, so to speak. And so that's why I really don't think liberalism, when it comes to family matters, is much of a thing. Mm. It is a tool that's used to destroy an old regime, and then a new regime that doesn't really honor the principles of liberalism arises in its place and creates a new culture with a new understanding of honor that limits choice and isn't all that interested in equality.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a bit about policy and get a little practical. What's some of the policy evidence that we see of feminism's rolling revolution in America, and then maybe we can talk about what should be done about that, given what's practical and prudent.
So the various ways in which feminism has shaped our laws, over the course of time. I mean, it begins with the inclusion of sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act as one of the bases for discrimination. That is, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. According to the 64 Civil Rights Act, almost immediately the Equal Opportunity Employment Council took up feminist issues. It was within about 6 years. It became illegal to advertise for jobs, to favor men in jobs instead of women, to pay a family wage. And and since then, there have been revisions to educational statutes. The most famous of those is Title IX.
Right.
There's been Equal Pay Acts passed. Certainly sexual harassment laws have been passed. And this has created a kind of defensive environment in most places of work, so that you need to give everyone a lot of training so that they can learn the proper sensitivity toward handling men and women in the workplace. And so I think those are the big ticket items are the anti-discrimination, the sexual harassment laws, equal pay laws, pregnancy. When you get pregnant, you can leave your job for a while and you're promised it back soon thereafter. Abortion, contraception not being able to be made illegal in various states by Supreme Court decisions. These, all happened within the first decade, really, of feminism's existence. And there've only been incremental accomplishments on top of those. The one thing that feminists have really fought for from the beginning that they haven't yet gotten is a kind of subsidized national daycare. Mm-hmm. Betty Friedan wrote in 1969 that without national daycare, it was all just window dressing. And because her idea was that women needed to be able to put their jobs before being mothers, and having basically, from their perspective, free daycare would be the route in which that could be accomplished. That's what happened in Sweden. That's what happened in all the sophisticated social democracies of Europe. That's what they wanted to bring here, and they haven't yet gotten that. So there are incremental steps toward that, like family leave. Maybe there'll be paid family leave. I believe California has paid family leave at the state level. And but those are all supposed to be kind of incremental steps toward, public provision of childcare. So that's kind of the infrastructure, what's happened, and what I think the ultimate aim of what those happenings is. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to the idea of rolling back the feminist accomplishments, I think that it needs to be hit in its weakest spots, and that that part of it is the anti-discrimination angle.
Right.
Much of feminist so there's two ways of going about this. One could use the Civil Rights Act to show that many places have now begun discriminating against hiring men and have, hiring quotas for women. I think many universities in their practices, betray this kind of practice.
To have a kind of de facto parity 50-50 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also, you could say, like, our colleges and universities are discriminatory in that 6 out of 10 of their students are women. Many of the disciplines are really dominated by women. So civil rights acts could be used against the idea that, I should say, to pursue the idea that men are being discriminated against. Or there might be ways of rolling back the whole idea that the law should be taking discrimination into account, and just allowing hiring practices to proceed and men and women to kind of self-select into whatever kind of jobs that they would like. This is one of my actual hobby horses. I'm really interested in how women take on certain professions like doctors, attorneys. I have a piece that's just out in the City Journal on women pilots. 93% of pilots are men. Mm-hmm. And for about 50 years, there's been interest groups and pressure groups forming around the idea that more women need to be pilots. And we've moved the percentage of women from 6% to 7% after all of this effort to recruit more female pilots. Can't we just be happy with the idea that maybe men and women are going to select different jobs,
right?
And stop doing all of this pressuring on it. So I don't think there's any legal way to stop such pressuring from happening in the kind of society that we have. But I would like to see it dishonored and considered to be a stupid investment, because we should expect men and women to make different decisions on these matters. The Wall Street Journal today had an article on the mining industry. Mm-hmm. And the mining industry is trying like the devil to recruit more women into mining. And no matter what they do, they can't get above 10% of their workforce who will actually go into the ground and dig things to be women. And so why is that? And they sit there and they pull their chins and they're so concerned about explaining this. And and it's like the macho culture of mining. They never actually think that maybe women don't want to mine. Yeah. And it's a dangerous job. And women tend not to take dangerous jobs. So I would like to see those kind of things really stigmatized, dishonored. I don't know that there's ways of making it illegal to do that.
Yeah.
But those pressure groups go after certain industries and they kind of paralyze them.
Yeah, my colleague comes from a long line of brewers, and she's very into that field. And she said that this is embroiling the brewing, the sort of craft brewing industry right now is their woman problem. Not, the analog's not great to mining. I don't think it's very dangerous to make beer, but it's it's kind of a manly enterprise in some ways, maybe limited ways. But yeah, this is rolling across everything. Our mutual friend David Azrad likes to joke, and maybe he got it from you, or he likes to point out, no one complains about the fact that most of the violent criminals in the country are men. This is not a great matter of, we'll only have perfect justice when half the violent criminals behind bars are women. It's there are certain aspects in which the claims of feminism pulled out to their logical conclusion are quite absurd and should be easily mocked, and we should do it more.
Well, I'd like to think that I'm making a contribution to that.
You are a healthy one. I should remind everyone that the book is again, The Recovery of Family Life: Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. It's a serious book, well researched. Scott had to read all sorts of things that none of you would ever want to read, but it's also quite funny at times and a lot of fun, unlike most of the writing coming out of the Academy. So congrats on that, Scott.
Thank you.
Right. So we talked a bit about the policies that have come about as a result of feminism. What you talked a little bit about sort of rolling it back. Well, if in your perfect world, given the constraints of modernity, and they're real, and some things, some genies you can't put back in some bottles, at least not without a cataclysmic civilizational collapse or something, and the rethinking of everything. But what would a much healthier family centered regime look like in America to Scott Yenor?
Well, the policy the policy goal that I would adopt is the idea that women should be encouraged to work part-time. And I think we could have many, I think about 3 out of 4 women would prefer part-time work, from what I can tell from the research. This is a pretty cross-cultural thing. Mm-hmm. There are some who are just career-oriented, who are very ambitious. I don't think we should do anything to get in their way. But 3 out of 4 would like to either balance work and family or prefer their family, especially when their children are still in the house.
Yeah.
And that we should find ways of preparing those women for careers that can be dropped and picked up. And we should really encourage that kind of work for women. And because you're right, I mean, we can't crawl backwards. We can't go back to the 50s or the 1850s, even though there were probably in some ways better mores and better expectations when it came to men and women in those eras. And so what does it look like going forward? I think I'm going to use maybe an anti-PC word here, but a soft patriarchal approach to marital life, where women will not be dishonored for working outside the home, but where it is expected that she will probably, in most cases, prioritize family and spend a lot of time raising her kids. I also think that it makes a lot of sense to devolve more responsibility onto families, so that they're more responsible for their children's education than they are in our current setup. That is, we should give more duties to the families so that men and women will be more occupied with their families. So that might mean educational choice in one way or another. Give the family more duties and responsibilities. They'll have to rise to the occasion and meet them. And then, support for other non-traditional ways of educating children follow from that. Things like homeschooling, where they would take a direct role in raising their children. So I think, the way forward toward a serious family life is giving the duties that the family is supposed to be taking on back to the family and away from the state.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of coincides with real concerns that people have about what schools are teaching. If we don't like what schools are teaching, well, then teach them yourself or find some other place to teach them. And so as the public institutions become more radicalized, I think one of the institutions that we have to lean on is family life. Mm-hmm. And we should lean on it by devolving responsibilities to it.
Yeah, I don't know how much you've looked into it, but I'm sure you're at least acquainted with it in a general sense. But I mean, one real area of reform that seems kind of in the weeds, but it could do a lot of, I think, offer a lot of help, and I think would have some maybe unintended or forgotten consequences that would be positive, would be reforming family law, right? Which family law, from what I read, is profoundly matriarchal these days, and really it can be a nightmare for fathers in all sorts of ways, and it has a lot to do with, I think, especially of children and divorce proceedings. That would be one area ripe for reform, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about that a little bit in the book. The it looks to me like about across the Western world, 7 out of 10 marriages are initiated by women. And part of the reason for that, or I should say part of the consequence of that, is that women don't do as well after divorce financially,
Right.
but they do better emotionally. Whereas men who come from a divorce, actually their life expectancy is really low, and their happiness indicators are way down there. And so men and women are in different ways victims of divorce. The no-fault at-will divorce regime that we have was a product promoted by feminism, passed in the years of great feminist reform across almost all 50 states in the early 70s. And I think some changes in the proceedings, like making the default position that men will have custody of the child, would actually cause more people to pause in making divorce. I mean, that's a small incremental change toward shaping our divorce law to the differences between men and women. That we want to encourage men to actually be able to invest in their families without fear of losing everything at the whim of a disaffected wife.
Right.
No one talked about that when divorce laws were being changed. Everyone thought the problem was going to be businessmen leaving their wives for their secretaries. No one thought that suddenly women would file for most of the divorces everywhere, and it would create this fracture between men and women. And it's something that totally could be revisited by changing some of the rules of the game within which negotiations take place.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but it just comes to mind. Is there any state or group of states that do this the best or the least bad in our current regime?
Oh, man, it's been years since I looked into that. I do remember that Iowa, I believe it was Iowa, had longer waiting periods. And it was in Marianne Glendon's book called Abortion and Divorce in Western Law. I think it was written in 1990. And she did not see that there was any ultimate difference between how some of the states that had waiting periods handled divorce compared with those that didn't have waiting periods. And that may have changed in the meantime since the research on which that book was done, since it was obviously 30 years ago.
Yeah. And then this to sort of widen that aperture again, I'm springing this on you, so it's fine if you don't know or haven't looked in a long time. But across the Western world and, post-modernity, modernity, does anyone get it right or mostly right or more right than the rest?
Yeah, there are differences, but they're mostly on the waiting period side. I don't think anyone has a fault-based divorce regime left in the Western world.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff I've looked at on that stuff, Ryan, are on the Western world. I don't know a lot about Japan or Korea's system on those things.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Would be interesting.
They've got separate but related crises in places like Japan.
Yeah.
Nobody getting married. Yeah. And then if I can, I guess even beyond divorce, is there, it's kind of a routine thing to bring up these days, but who does it best in Europe? Is it Hungary? I mean, they're aggressively trying to promote family formation and to reverse their, a problem not confined to them alone, but really across the Western world, across actually more than half the globe, of falling fertility, falling birth rates.
Yeah. So this is one of these things that it's kind of a mystery.
Yeah.
The country that has the highest birth rates and kind of the best marital results is Israel.
Right.
The birth rates in Israel are about 3, whereas I don't think any other country in Europe is over 2. And so it's 50% bigger than any of the European countries. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And not only that, but it's risen. It was where all the European countries were in 2000. And after the last 20 years, Israel went up 1, and almost all the European countries have gone down about 0.5.
Yeah.
So, but then on the other hand, and Israel has a very generous welfare state supporting family choices. They pursue all of the sexual liberation agenda within Israel. There's
Right.
great rights for homosexuals and for trans people, as I understand it in Israel. And but nevertheless, they have this like very high birth rate. And so, what is it? And it just shows that the choice to have children is a very complex choice, not only shaped or really shaped very much, I think, by economic choices, but by one's investment in the future, one's hope for one's country, the feeling that one might have of being involved in an important community that's going to last beyond your own life.
Right.
I think those kind of spiritual aspects of decision making lead to Israel having a much healthier birth rate than anyone in Europe. And the depressing part is that America is really part of the European decline as opposed to Israeli hopefulness. And America used to be kind of distinctive when it came to this, but now it's not. And so I really do think that what Hungary has done when it comes to public information and public relations has been crucial in reversing a very low birth rate, a very low marriage rate. There are also economic benefits that now attach to having children and getting married in Hungary. But I think the campaign really just to encourage marriage. When you land in Budapest airport, there are posters all over the place with men and women holding the hands of children. Compare that to the gangways of Delta. You will not see a married group or a married couple on Delta's gangway. And so I do think that a kind of public information, public relations campaign like Hungary has run has moved the needle a lot in that country, supported some by economic considerations.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd want to, right. That would be the kind of cultural, propaganda, as I use that just in this sort of clinical sense.
You mean it as a compliment?
Yes, that's right. Wing of it would be, to make large families like they were in, say, Victorian England, make marriage and large families high status and like the peak of culture. That would be one goal, and part of that would just be marketing it that way. That would be a start, at least.
Yeah, and I don't know that they do that in Israel. I mean, I haven't been there in 5 years or so, and that was never my impression that they did it. So I think that is part of a solution for a different kind of political culture.
Right.
I mean, if you have a lot of pride in your country and you think like it's really important for your people, well, you might have a lot of kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's true in Israel, even if you pull out the ultra-Orthodox, right? Their birth rate's still better than Europe, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. When you pull out the ultra-Orthodox, it's like 2.8. I mean, because the ultra-Orthodox don't make up a huge percentage of the population.
Yeah, they have tons of kids, but there's not a lot of them. Interesting. Yeah. Let's close on I'm gambling here. Because I don't know your response to this question, but do you have any signs for hope for the future of America and in regards to family life, family policy?
Well, it seems to me like what's been going on in most facets of the country are going on in family life. That is, a lot of people are seeing what they're up against, and many of them have a lot of kids and prioritize their families, and they can do well. I just happen to live here in Idaho, where I often get embarrassed when I tell people I have 5 children, and they're like, "Only 5 children?" And it happens here. Like it never happened in my life when I lived in Wisconsin that I met people with that many children. So they're just parts of the country where having large families is not only acceptable, but it's considered to be great.
Right.
And those are the parts of the country that are, they're growing. There might be a future there. There's a kind of sickness and sadness in our big cities. There's, not a lot of people having a lot of children. And I've read, I can't remember where I read it, that San Francisco has among the lowest child rates in the world.
Yeah.
Like there are so few children there. I've never seen a child in San Francisco that wasn't my own. And actually, that might sound bad. But, I don't visit very often. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of these things that's totally a bifurcated America on this issue.
Yeah.
And so the relative health of one section of the country as opposed to the other might lead to some sort of long-term change, but there's not going to be a short-term change.
Yeah. Well, the already present oligarchic tendencies in big blue cities, especially cost of living and everything else, kind of exacerbate this problem too. Drives, I can't imagine trying to raise one child, let alone more than one, in Manhattan, unless, somehow your household income is north of $600,000, and maybe now that's not quite enough. And San Francisco is similar.
Yes.
Yeah. We all have to move to the sticks like you, Scott, and procreate.
Well, they are. I don't know about the procreating part, but I'm in the house of a Californian right now recording this with you. And
yeah,
we have a kind of friendly invasion going on here in Idaho.
Yeah, that's good. I hear the same thing about places like Texas. There's much, it's off topic for us, but yeah, there's much hemming and hawing by red staters about the influx of blues from blue states. But the data so far is that it's a lot of reds leaving blue states to make red states redder. So let's hope it remains the case.
Gives us some breathing space to try to build something up.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thanks for this, Scott. Do you want to add anything by way of a plug as we go out? I should recommend to everyone to go read the excellent review by Harvey Mansfield in the latest Claremont Review books of Scott's book. Harvey, of course, has been writing about manliness and, had de Beauvoir's number long ago. And it was wonderful to get him to review the book, and he liked it quite a bit. So if you don't subscribe to Claremont Review books, go to ClaremontReviewBooks.com, check out the review of Scott's book, and buy the book too.
Yes, no, I appreciate your having me on, Ryan, and the support that Claremont gave by recruiting Harvey to review the book. It was kind of an embarrassing review. It was so glowing. So
I would say that we didn't pay him to write the review, but that I would be lying. But we don't demand positive reviews.
It would be wrong if I paid it.
That would be true. Yeah, if you sent him a check. Well, thank you, Scott, and hope we see each other before too long here. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Ryan, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you for listening to The Interview. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at claremont.org, americanmind.org, ClaremontReviewBooks.com, and our new Washington Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. I'll remind everyone that Scott Yenor, my interlocutor today, is a Washington Fellow at our DC Center, even though his day job is at Boise State. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, as always, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you all for listening.